In today's video, we're going to cover Chapter 5, which is all about extinction. Now, whenever I think of extinction, I think of that kind of extinction. So this little graphic always makes me smile. But for the kind of extinction we're going to be talking about, we're going to be looking at extinction that is a process that weakens operant behavior. So in Chapter 4, we discussed how reinforcement is responsible for how we acquire and maintain operant behavior. Now we're going to talk about weakening that process. So, as you might expect, we'll start off with a definition. So, extinction is the procedure of withholding reinforcers that are responsible for maintaining a particular behavior. In this graph at the bottom here, we're seeing cumulative responses on our y-axis and minutes on the x-axis here, and these are resetting, so it's telling us these are going to be sessions, so series of trials. And so if we look at just the first one here, from 0 to 20-something, we see an increase in responding, an increase in that cumulative response rate, up until the end of the session, and then it starts over the next day. They learn to respond more and more and more again, and then we see something different here, and this is where extinction is happening. And so what we can assume is that during these normal trials where we're seeing this increase in responding, this increase in cumulative responses, that the birds, I guess, involved here would be rewarded for a particular behavior, and because they're being rewarded, they're going to respond more. So we see that rise in responding. But here, we see a little bit of responding, and then it sort of stops. So if there's no reward present, if we've withheld that reinforcement, then we're going to have this drop-off in responding. So let's look more in depth into how we can talk about extinction. So in order to see extinction, we're looking at specifically a behavior that has been previously reinforced, something that there was some kind of operant conditioning going on with in the beginning. Maybe a bird has been reinforced to peck a particular key, or a rat to press a lever, and they were being reinforced with food or something good like that. The second contingency here is that this behavior is now no longer being followed by the reinforcing consequences. So the bird had previously gotten food for pecking at a particular key, and now they are no longer getting that food after they peck the key. And the third part is that as a result of these two things here, that behavior is going to be weakened, meaning that the behavior of interest is going to decrease or stop occurring in the future. So the bird used to get food for pecking a key, now they no longer get food for pecking that key, and as a result, we see a reduction in key pecking from that point forward. Kind of like what we're seeing right here, where there's that stop in responding with that flat line there. So with this extinction, the present action is that the behavior is no longer being reinforced. And what that means for the future is that the behavior stops occurring or occurs less often or less intensely. Now, I will briefly note here that in this point here, number 2, where we're saying that it is no longer, that behavior is no longer followed by the reinforcing consequences, if even once there is reinforcement, if the bird pecks the key and 100 pecks, they don't get any food, but then on the 101st peck, they do get food, then extinction really won't happen because they've now been reinforced for it again, so they're going to persist with their pecking behavior. So to have effective extinction, it kind of has to be an absolute stopping of reinforcement here. But if we do manage to have a complete stop in that reinforcement, and we start seeing that reduction in behavior, at the end we can say that a behavior has either undergone extinction or that the behavior has been extinguished. Those terms tend to be used interchangeably. Now, it is good to note that it is the behavior that has undergone extinction, not the organism who's participating. So you wouldn't say that a bird has undergone extinction or the bird has been extinguished. The behavior that that bird has been displaying is what's undergone extinction or been extinguished. So just to keep in mind on how to talk about it. So for examples of extinction, there are lots and lots of these in the textbook, and I'm sure you've encountered lots in the real world. Things like you have a garage door opener, and you get into your car and you push the button on the garage door opener and it doesn't open. So maybe in the future, you're going to manually open the door because your button doesn't work. Maybe you like to tell jokes, but you're in a new class and there's new people around and you tell a joke and no one laughs. So you try the next day and no one laughs. So over time, you're going to tell fewer and fewer jokes. You can even get into behavioral stuff with modifying behavior in children. So if a child is misbehaving and the parents stop reacting to their bad behavior, over time, that lack of attention will lead the child to stop misbehaving. There are tons and tons of examples, but those are just a couple. Now, when extinction first starts, when your reinforcer is no longer following a particular behavior, there are three broad categories of things that may initially occur. The first of these is an extinction burst, which is what we're going to talk about in just a second here. We can also see the occurrence of novel behaviors or the occurrence of emotional outbursts, but we'll come to those two in just a second. For our extinction bursts, these are what happen when you see an increase in either the frequency, the duration, or the intensity, or maybe all three, of the unreinforced behavior during the extinction process. Now, this usually happens fairly early on in the extinction process. So right after you stop reinforcing a particular behavior, we would expect to see an extinction burst. Not always, but in a lot of cases. And more examples, but this time focusing on this extinction burst. If you're having car problems, your car won't start. So usually when you get in your car, you turn the key, your engine starts, you get to drive. But if you're having problems, you turn the key and the engine makes an awful sound but doesn't start. So maybe next you're going to turn your key for even longer. Instead of the usual quick turn of the key, now you're going to hold it for 5 seconds. Maybe you're going to turn it more aggressively or harder. Maybe you're going to try it over and over and over again. So that would be an extinction burst because we've increased either frequency, duration, and or intensity in that behavior. Same with malfunctioning vending machines. You put your money in, push the particular button or code of the thing that you want, and nothing comes out. So maybe you hit it again and again. Maybe you hit it harder. Same with TV remotes or whatever. So lots of ways that we can see this. Now, what does that look like in our data? So orient ourselves on the graph here. We have length of time screaming in minutes. So this would be, say, a child who cries at bedtime. And so the parents are trying to get them to stop crying and screaming before they go to bed. So the baseline is what happens before our extinction procedure. So this is just the child cries every night at bedtime. And we look at them for 5 days. So 5 different bedtimes. The child cries for about 6 minutes each night. And so we have, again, our divider here between phases. Next, we enter the extinction phase or the extinction procedure. And so this would be that the parents decide to let the child cry it out. So instead of going into the room, they withhold the previous reinforcer of giving the kid attention. So the first night afterwards, you see that instead of the 6 minutes of crying, we get 8 minutes. The night after that, we get almost 10 minutes. And so it takes an additional 4 days of this extinction procedure for their responding for this length of time crying in minutes to drop below the original baseline. So this peak here would be considered an extinction burst, where they're crying longer. Maybe they're crying louder or more intensely. So this is what we're seeing here. Now, most of the examples that we've used here have been with behaviors that were originally positively reinforced. So the child used to get attention, or when you put money into a vending machine, then it would give you something that you wanted from it. Those are positively reinforced situations. But you can also have extinction with negatively reinforced scenarios. An example could be a child having a temper tantrum at the dinner table because they don't want to eat their broccoli. If for the pre-extinction phase, if the child cries and the parents say, okay, fine, we won't make you eat broccoli, we'll take away the broccoli, then that would be something that is negatively reinforced. They've taken away something aversive. They took away the food that the child doesn't want to eat. So in this case, extinction there would be that the parents don't remove the aversive stimulus. So no matter the situation, we want to make sure that we talk about extinction where the appropriate reinforcer needs to be extinguished. So either you remove a positive reinforcer or no longer remove an aversive stimulus. So in both of those cases, we're seeing that the behavior is weakened. It's just in different ways based on how the behavior is being reinforced. All right, so those are extinction bursts and kind of a bit of an aside there. I also said that there were 2 other things that could happen once the reinforcer is no longer following that particular behavior. So 2 other things that can happen when you start with extinction. The first is the occurrence of novel behaviors, which is also called operant variability. And this is basically when you when you start the process of extinction, you can see a greater occurrence of different behaviors. So we'll go back to our example of a bird, probably a pigeon, pecking a key for food. If pecking that key no longer gets them food, they're going to start doing other novel behaviors in order to try and find what they need to do in order to get food again. So maybe they're going to start pecking another key, or maybe they're going to start turning around or moving to one side of the cage or the other. So we see this variability in their behavior, and the idea is that by doing different things, they're trying to increase the likelihood of reinstating reinforcement. So maybe they're going to find a behavior that gets them the reinforcement that they're not getting anymore, by possibly contacting other sources of reinforcement. So they're going to do other things to see if they can find another way to get the reinforcement they're no longer getting. This doesn't always happen, but it can happen. And then the third thing is that you can see the occurrence of either emotional or aggressive behaviors. So kind of ties into our extinction bursts where you see an increase in frequency or intensity, but these are usually tied with emotional outbursts as well. So you're putting your money into a vending machine and you hit the button and it doesn't work. So maybe you're going to get mad about it. Maybe you're going to be sad about it. Maybe you start crying or yelling. Maybe you start shaking the machine. That actually might fall under this idea of operant variability because you're doing a new behavior with an emotional background on it. So a little bit of overlap here. But you're doing something new and you're doing it in an emotional way to try and get that reward that you expected to get but aren't getting now. So those are a couple of ways that we can respond to the onset of extinction. Another really cool aspect of extinction is the idea of spontaneous recovery. Now, this is the tendency for an extinguished behavior to occur again in situations that are either the same as or similar to those where it had been previously reinforced. So our pigeon pecking a particular button, and we went through the whole extinction process, so their pecking behavior was extinguished, but maybe the next day you put them in a different operant box and they see a button, they might start pecking it again because it's the same setup. It's a box, there's a button. If I peck it, maybe I'll get food. So if we see that kind of reoccurrence of the behavior, we call that spontaneous recovery. Now, if extinction is still in place, so if you put a pigeon back in an operant box and pecking that key still doesn't get them food, they're not going to persist on that behavior for very long because previously the behavior had been extinguished. They learned that pecking that key doesn't get them food anymore. So in this new scenario, it's kind of like they're testing the waters to see if it works yet. And they would decide very quickly that no, it doesn't, and they go back to ignoring it. So you can reduce the occurrence of these instances of spontaneous recovery by using repeated extinction sessions. So if you have, say, one day you would have the pigeon in the box, you go through extinction down to nothing, the next day you bring them back to the box, they'd peck a little bit at the beginning, but it's still in that extinction phase, so they'd stop fairly quickly. If you do that multiple days in a row, they'll have much less spontaneous recovery. A fantastic way to help that along is to use multiple settings. So maybe not the same box, maybe similar boxes, maybe a key that isn't in a box, but maybe it's in an open area or something like that. So if you get them to learn that picking keys anywhere doesn't get you food, you'd be a lot less likely to see spontaneous recovery. For real-world examples of where we'd see spontaneous recovery, we could look at, say, a clinical setting. If you have someone who's deathly afraid of spiders, and they see a therapist and they go through lots of sessions to extinguish their fear of spiders, but the next day they're out in the real world and they encounter a spider, they might still experience that feeling of fear because it's in a new place. So they had learned to be okay with spiders in their therapist's office, but in a new location, it didn't quite carry over. They get that spontaneous recovery again. So you'd want to go through that extinction process in multiple locations at multiple times, just to try and help this from not happening. And if we want to look at sort of some graphs of what this kind of data would look like, again, we have mean response frequency, so how many times are they responding, and these are in minutes, so this would be one session, this would be another session, and another, and another, and another, and so on. And so here you can see that at the beginning, so this would be at the beginning of an extinction session, they have fairly high responding, and as time goes on, there's less and less responding until at the very end, there's pretty much no responding. And then the idea would be you take a little bit of a break, you come in the next day, and there's a little bit of responding at the beginning, not as high as they started on the first day. There's still going to be some responding, a little bit less, but not none. And it drops off again fairly quickly again. And then the day after that, there's a little bit of responding, even less than the day previously, and it trails off really quickly, and so on and so forth. And so eventually, after multiple days, you see very little spontaneous recovery here, and that extinction works much, much faster as time goes on. But we do still see that little bit of an uptick in that behavior, that responding occurring, usually after a break in time or a change in scene. All right, well, if extinction is going to occur, there must be ways that we can try and mitigate or prevent extinction. So let's talk about some of these ways to resist extinction. One of the biggest ones is using partial reinforcement. So the partial reinforcement effect basically tells us that the type of schedule of reinforcement that you use plays a huge role in how resistant a particular behavior is to extinction. Any of our intermittent schedules of reinforcement, those will usually have a behavior persist much, much longer than if you had used continuous reinforcement. So if you have a pigeon in the operant box and 1 out of every 10 pecks gets them food, then if on the 11th peck they still haven't gotten food, it might take them a little while to realize that they haven't gotten food right away. But if that pigeon, every single time they peck the key, they get food, the first time they peck and don't get food, they're going to know right away. So the more variability, the more intermittent or unpredictable our schedule of reinforcement is, the longer the animal tends to persist with that behavior, and the more resistant they are to extinction because of that uncertainty. So the intermittent types of, or the intermittent schedules of reinforcement are a lot better. And within those, the ones that are variable are going to be, again, even more effective, even more resistant to extinction because of that unpredictable nature. Other things that affect resistance to extinction, one of them we've already talked a little bit about, and that is the occurrence of reinforcement at any point following the initiation of extinction. So if you're trying to extinguish a behavior, you want to make sure that no reinforcement is given after the point you start the extinction. Even a single trial where they get reinforcement can throw off the whole extinction process. So it's really important that there isn't any reoccurrence of reinforcement once the extinction has started. Otherwise, they'll just relearn the behavior and go back to responding normally. An example of this, if we go back to the child who's crying and the parents who are letting them cry it out, if one night they have a babysitter and the babysitter goes in and checks on the child, instead of doing what the parents have been doing, which is ignoring the child's crying, then the child is going to resume crying at bedtime because they were reinforced for that behavior one time. You can also see a return of a particular responding behavior if there's reinforcement of a functionally equivalent behavior. So if a pigeon was getting reinforced for pecking a red key, but you're going through the extinction process to make them stop pecking the red key, if they're then given the chance to peck a blue key that gets them food, they might go back and start pecking the red key again, because it's fairly similar to the blue key, and maybe they can get food from both, so they'll try it. So similar other behaviors that are reinforced can cause them to start doing the originally reinforced behavior, even though it was going through extinction or even though it had been extinguished. So a couple of different things that can affect extinction there. And for our final thoughts on extinction, I want to point out that extinction isn't unlearning. Extinction is actually new learning. So the pigeon with his key, he's not sort of unlearning that pecking that key gets food. He's learning something new, that pecking this key no longer gets me food. But because we see that spontaneous recovery, we know that they haven't unlearned that original association. Instead, they've learned something new, and what they had originally learned will sometimes pop up again, as we see with our spontaneous recovery.